Welcome to the Human Podcast. I'm your host, Min, and co-founder of Human. Human is building an app that can track your high or low mood symptoms automatically. Check us out at www.human.uk and follow us on Instagram at human.mh. Hey guys, welcome back to the 8th episode of our first series on eating disorders. In my last episode, I spoke to you about how difficult festive seasons and holiday periods can be for people experiencing stress around eating, exercising, and body image. Today, I'm here to talk about what recovery means to me, talk about any remaining symptoms that I'm still experiencing to this day, and share what's in my mental health toolbox that I use to stay resilient. And you know what's next, our usual super quick housekeeping. This is not a professional medical advice. So if you need professional medical help, please seek that support in your local area. But without further ado, let's get into it. Today, I'm going to start with a few definitions, actually. So you may have heard of the word remission. Remission in clinical terms is when you have made sufficient improvement in your condition so that you're no longer quite meeting the diagnostic criteria in that moment. So for example, in bulimia nervosa, which is what I had experienced as a teen, I could have reduced my binge eating and purging episode from twice a week to once every 2 to 3 weeks. And this could still, depending on the diagnostic criteria, could qualify as reaching remission. It's really important to acknowledge this broadness around the definition of remission, because let's say that there are two individuals, A and B. A has no symptoms at all after treatment, whilst B is still experiencing symptoms that is significantly impacting their life. Yet clinically, they are both classified as reaching remission. I want you to understand that clinical definitions around topics of recovery, although I'm just going to clarify in a minute how recovery slightly differs from the word remission, but the point goes back to how we need to be a little bit more careful around what recovery and remission means. By this point, I'm sure somebody has been wondering, what is recovery and how is that different from remission? What is remission and what is recovery? So recovery in clinical terms is often when we reached remission and have stayed in remission for an X amount of time. So for example, if you are diagnosed with an eating disorder, you would reach remission first, and then after an X amount of time, you would reach recovery. So my personal interpretation of the word recovery, so not in clinical definitions, but my interpretation is a little bit broader to include not just the clinical state or diagnosis that's improved, but I'm thinking about the social, psychological, and behavioral elements around reaching recovery. If I was in extreme distress, worrying about my eating and worrying about my exercise like I did during my COVID lockdown, although I wasn't clinically identified as having a relapse, because I was suffering psychologically so much, I would classify that with myself as having relapsed or having dipped below that recovery threshold. And I would argue at that time, I didn't feel like I counted as having reached full recovery. So we need to use this opportunity to acknowledge that recovery can mean different things for different people, different conditions, and even different countries, and even different diagnostic criteria. And why am I going on about these definitions and what recovery and remission means? Why is this important? I think it's so important for you to know that the terms recovery used in the clinical or the medical world does not necessarily mean that you are living completely symptom-free in reality. And for you to know that recovery is not a one-stop shop business in mental health. I think it's quite dangerous to think that recovery means completely being symptom-free, and for you to think that you reach it once and that's it. Because That's what I thought, to convince myself after having recovered from bulimia to turn a complete blind eye to my ongoing disordered symptoms that was brewing towards orthorexia. I told myself, no, I reached recovery once, so now I'm definitely fine, I'm okay. That was until things gotten so bad enough that it became too obvious for me that I was not fine. I want to use this opportunity to encourage you to see as recovery as riding waves. Rather than a straight parallel single line that just keeps stable once you reach recovery or remission, that's not how life works, in my opinion. We sometimes go uphill and we sometimes stay the same, and sometimes we go crashing down. It's about managing this wave so that it doesn't build up over a significant threshold, that it leaves us tumbling down. What are some of the symptoms that I still experience to this day that I have to ride out? There are a couple of things, and I like to go through them with you and open up about the symptoms that comes and goes depending on the size of my waves and the presence of my waves. Number one is, I think I mentioned this before, but it's about looking at my Apple Watch fitness status around 10 to 15 times a day. And I do this almost subconsciously when I'm having breakfast, when I'm sat in the toilet, before I go to bed, whilst I'm going on a walk, in the supermarket. It'll just come completely randomly. And the second thing is, sometimes my brain starts automatically calculating calories before I even know it, with the intention to sneakily compare how much calories I must have eaten versus I must have burnt today. But when this happens, it happens so quickly. And I almost recognize myself doing it, and I'm surprised because it's like, oh, it happens so quickly. I'm on autopilot. And it shows the significance of habit that I've been building up throughout my years of disordered eating. And it takes a lot of energy to sort of maintain these out of my life. And the third one is around feeling guilty if I hadn't exercised for usually around 2 to 3 days. But sometimes if I am feeling more vulnerable, I'll feel awful after even 1 day of having not done any exercise. And that is still something that I experience to this day, that can get worse, or sometimes it's manageable. And the fourth one is around feeling guilty after a big meal or a period of time where I've eaten more food than I usually would have done. Now, I'd love to say and pretend I never have this anymore and I'm all good, I'm completely recovered all the time, I never have any dips, I'm always good, but that's not true. Sometimes I still feel guilty, and I sometimes feel so uncomfortable in my own skin still. But it's okay, because I know how to manage them to prevent them become bigger waves that would really start affecting my life and my well-being. And the final point that I wanted to share with you today was just in general feeling guilty about how I look and feeling bigger, just physically bigger during holidays or when I'm going to a party, trying on a dress, for pretty much no apparent reason. Again, this just fluctuates up and down as my life goes through. And there are so many more than just these few examples that I've pinched for you today. And a combination of these basically comes and goes, or it could get worse, or it could get better. Like, literally, I've been saying, like a wave that fluctuates. You know, everybody feels a little bit crap in their skin sometimes, and that's completely okay. Just recognize that feeling, acknowledge it, and accept it with generosity. I see this fluctuation or wave as something really natural, and I see this as a motivation to make better decisions in my day-to-day life to impact this wave so that I can look after my mental health within a range of that wave that I am happy with. So over time, I came to develop a toolbox that I can dip into and that I can use when things are heading a little bit downwards, maybe a little bit too down, to deploy and to take action proactively. Like I said, to keep myself within a zone that I can live my best life. And let me share some of the key tools that I have in my toolbox that I use to look after my mental health. And I'll tell you a bit about when I use these tools. But please note that your toolbox will look completely different according to your experiences, your psychological feelings, and environmental factors. So use my examples to start reflecting on what yours could look like and identifying your toolbox items. The first element in my tool is something that I use when I start thinking about food between my meals. And that usually means that I've been slightly underfed and potentially I just need to naturally eat a bit more to toss this balance back up, because I might have been subconsciously building up little nuggets of habits that led me to eat less than my body needs. So I try to tune in, and if I start thinking about food a little bit too much, then I start to think about, okay, I must be hungry. So let's try to just give myself a little bit more food on purpose. And this is important because if I don't do this, my waves will start getting bigger and bigger by my subconscious self potentially trying to lose a bit of weight and lose a little bit more weight. And that's why I have to interfere before that wave gets bigger, and I will purposefully feed myself a little bit more food than usual to make up for this balance. The next element is around when I feel really just crap in my own skin, because sometimes I just do. I take a nice warm, clean shower, really take my time, put some music on, put some really nice smelling candles on. I get cozy up in a dressing gown. I read my book and I might put on a face mask, and I know this just works. And this is something that I find really interesting, just on a side note, that when I feel a little bit mentally overwhelmed, I don't look after myself physically as much as I would like to. So I'm not talking about exercise necessarily here, but it's about treating myself to a really long, easy shower and putting candles on for myself, putting really nice, like fluffy dressing gown on and taking care of myself. I just don't do this when I'm in a really bad space. So when I start to feel overwhelmed, it really helps if I proactively do this first. Almost has like a counter impact, almost preventing myself to feel worse, which is something that I have been finding really helpful. And the third point that I wanted to discuss with you and share with you might be a little bit unique for myself. It's about going to coffee shops if I feel like life is a little bit crap. And I won't go into too much about why coffee shops mean so much to me. It might be a South Korean thing. So if you know anybody who's from South Korea, they are highly likely to be quite just in love with going to coffee shops. And that's the culture I grew up in when I was younger. And that's sort of the culture that I go back to when I see my friends from home. And I just find coffee shops so therapeutic, and the sound and the smell of coffee, people going by and doing my work with headphones on. It's just so wonderful and healing for me. So when I am feeling a little bit down and a bit crap, I take myself to a coffee shop, which is just really nice. The next tool in my toolbox is about reminding myself that I'm allowed to keep people at arm's length if their behaviors show that perhaps our values are a little bit too different and their values are making me crave my old disordered eating habits. And this is something that took me so long to embrace and to remind myself, because as a child, I'm not sure what psychological impact sort of my parenting and my childhood must have developed, but I get very strongly influenced by my desires to keep other people happy and to please other people and to do as they wish. And it's taken me quite some time to learn that actually I'm allowed to keep a distance if they talk about dieting all the time, if they talk about having to lose weight all the time, I would have to keep a distance. And now I'm okay with that. And guys, I cannot stress enough of how much of a big impact that started to have in my life, because people around you almost make up who you are in a way. And it's so important to surround yourself with people who have the same values, or who already have reached the sort of recovery state, or they always have been living like that, where you want to be. I find this incredibly empowering. So wanted to share that one with you guys today. And the next tool in the toolbox is also really interesting. And it's about choosing what I see and what I get to read in the digital space. I actively remove content and refuse content that is being suggested to me that is related to unhealthy dieting, or diet culture, as some people might refer to it, because I know it's not good for me. I'm not interested. And even looking at some of these cover photos and some catchy phrases on the title is unhealthy for me, and it slips me back into my old habits. So I know that I can empower myself, even in the digital social media world that can be really volatile, by telling the algorithm not to suggest me posts like this, and to stop hearing from that influencer that's not got the same values as you have. And just remember that you have the power to do that, or you can try your best to start informing what you want to be recommended and what you would like to see. And if you ever come across, if I ever come across content that just isn't going to do me good, I just quickly scroll through if I can't even reject that content. So this is, again, a really important point that I wanted to raise awareness with you today. The next tool in my toolbox is around super quickly distracting myself when I start subconsciously counting calories in my head. And trust me, this just happens when I'm in the shower. Sometimes randomly, counting calories is just a notorious habit that I can't stop fully, because it's been in my habit for so long that my brain just starts doing it sometimes if I feel a little bit nervous around food that day. So when this happens, I start singing, I start thinking about random other things to try and really put a block to my subconscious mind calculating calories, because as long as I don't reach that outcome of the calculating calories activity, so as long as I never reach that final value of how much calorie I have burnt, in a way I can be free from overthinking about that number in a day, right? So I do have a little bit of time to stop myself. So if I've already counted calories by lunchtime, then I can kind of tell myself, really distract my mind to stop, that I'm not interested, I don't want to know, because as soon as I have that number for the day, that's going to linger in my head, and it's going to naturally lead to thinking about how much exercise I've done that day, how many steps I've taken that day, to almost work it all out and give myself guilt and the pressure to burn more tomorrow. So I'm just really being mindful that I should stay away from that as much as I can, and trying to beat this subconscious mind to it. And it's worked quite well for me, because it happened a lot more frequently. And as soon as I started sort of actively distracting these thoughts and refusing myself from counting calories, over time, it has started to go down and down and down. And nowadays it only happens sort of when I'm, like I mentioned, feeling a little bit vulnerable. So I hope my experiences around these counting calories is quite helpful for you to reflect on what you might find helpful, because I think counting calories just feeds into so many of the negative impacts that we experience around eating anxiety, exercising obsession, everything. So please keep that in mind. The next one that I want to tell you about from my mental health toolbox is something that I use when I start getting a little bit too obsessed with exercising. And now I'm still developing this tool out, so it's not perfect, but what I would do is I would switch out my exercises with the ones that actually don't burn much calories. So almost like doing the opposite thing that my disordered eating habits would want me to. Because my old disordered eating habits would tell me to do more exercise that burns more calories and do it every single day. So as soon as I noticed this subconscious desires and like obsessions around exercising, I completely go, okay, no. I'm going to do exercises that are focused on my mind, my breathing, not on burning energy. Things like slow yoga or mindful walking even. And if I want to do intense exercise for my mind, then I might consider not wearing my fitness watch. And what I'm doing here is I'm proactively deflating my desires that belong to my old disordered eating ego in a way. So instead of playing into these desires that come from old habits, I go the opposite way. Now, this feels quite uncomfortable to start with, but it has done me so much good over time, and it's so worth it, even if it feels incredibly uncomfortable going the opposite way to what your emotional, quick-thinking brain wants you to do. The last sort of tool that I wanted to mention with you today is around if I start getting a little bit nervous around having sweet food, I actually go and buy myself a slice of cake or a pastry and do almost, again, like I mentioned, do the opposite of what my old disordered eating habits would expect me to do. Because I would have done in the past, completely avoided sweet food because it's making me nervous. But as soon as I notice myself getting nervous around sweet food, I will do the exact opposite and give myself more sweet food, almost counteract and not letting my desires build up and not letting myself crave something. This applies to me uniquely because of my previous background around restrictive dieting and bulimia. So your experience might be a lot different, so this might not apply to you, but for me, it's really been so helpful to dissolve these desires before they build up into a big magnitude where I feel like I'm crashing down in this wave and I'm losing control and I'm just being dragged around by my anxiety around food. So this is something that has been really helpful and enjoyable at the same time. So within these toolboxes, I have a few dialogues with myself as well that I still use to remind myself. So it's not necessarily a tool, but they're almost like a quick grab self-dialogue, self-comment that I'll remind myself if I'm struggling to keep well. And there are 4 things. If I'm concerned about losing people just because I've gained a bit of weight over Christmas or I've gained a bit of weight before a holiday, I'll remind myself that, you know, if they do leave me, they're not the right people to keep anyway. So don't get socially anxious about weight gain. Don't think about that. Focus on myself. And the second comment that I always remind myself is that everything will pass. If I'm feeling really crappy one day, I know it will go. The third thing I remind myself is thinking about, okay, how would I speak to my best friend if she said what I just thought out loud? I would go, oh my goodness, you don't say that to yourself. You look gorgeous. You look beautiful. That's what you should say to yourself. This is an opportunity to remind myself that I should treat myself in the same way as I would for the people I love the most in my life. Okay? And the last one is something that some of you might find quite bleak and a bit too heavy, but I had to share with you because it always has such a huge impact on my life. And I look at everything in a slightly different lens when I remind myself that I only get to live once on this earth, and there is no guarantee that I'll be alive tomorrow. And it's quite sad in a way, people might think, but oddly for me, this has been one of the most empowering thought that enables me to tune in straight away with my surroundings and for me to realize how grateful I really am to be sat here telling you about my experiences, to be lucky enough to have the people that support me, to have the food that I can even worry about in the first place. All of these things become so much more real as soon as I understand how precious today is, and more than that, how precious this moment is right now. So these are the things I've put together today that has been really doing a lot of good for me. Well, at least for me in the current phase. Keep this in mind because this might change as our years go by and we enter different phases in our lives. And like I mentioned before, this might look completely different between individuals, different cultures. So maybe life is about us building this toolbox and finding out what works for us, So I'm so curious to know what you have in your toolbox that works for you. So if you have an opportunity to leave comments down below, especially if you're watching this on YouTube, I don't know whether you can comment on a podcast platform, but please share with us what you have in your mental well-being toolbox. And once you get comfortable with your toolbox and once you get a little bit confident about riding out the waves that this mental health crazy life is throwing at us, then why don't we start thinking about how we can spread this support and the concept of resilience? Because ultimately, it's each of us that make up a friendship, a relationship, a friendship group, a family, a class, a society. So the positive changes can start from you, from me, and that can spread quickly. So I'm going to give you 2 things that you should take away as food for thought. The first thing is around what can we do to help people around us to feel accepted and included? What can we do? How can we check in with them? How can we make them feel accepted, that they're good enough? And the second aspect to think about is when you feel safe and supported, share this experience perhaps with others and share what you've learned, what you felt, what you realized with others. Help us build a community and help others to get a chance to reflect on from your experiences, which is incredibly valuable, by the way. You'll be so surprised how much impact your story can bring in helping other people feel empowered, supported, stronger, relieved. So don't be shy. Every story is unique, and I want you to think about that and remember and consider sharing your story with others when you have the opportunity to do so. So guys, this marks our last episode talking about my personal experience with disordered eating and bulimia and recovery and so much more that we talked about. Now, I might surprise you with a few more episodes on this topic, although I might be venturing slightly further away from my own stories. So do keep your eyes peeled. But in our future seasons, we'll look at broader than eating disorders, of course. We'll look at depression, we'll look at anxiety, we'll look at bipolar disorder and more. And we also want to share some knowledge about the most promising technologies and research in this space so that you can become an expert and you can have all of these resources to reflect and help inform how you make decisions in your own lives. At this point, I'd like to remind you that Human is building an app that can automatically model your behaviors around mood, whether that's low mood or high mood, using your anonymized smartphone data. To get access to this app, please sign up at human.uk. If you have somebody that you think I should interview on the podcast, please contact us through the Human website as well and share us your thoughts and your recommendations. Also, if you have experienced difficulties around managing mood before, you can actually go to the bottom of the contacts page on our website, human.uk, and fill out a really simple form to apply to join our user support group. We host workshops, interviews, design tests that are really fun, where you can share your opinions, your story, your experiences to start shaping what we do, the innovation and the future of mental health technologies, which is really exciting. Guys, I want to say a massive thank you for being here with me today, for listening to my story as friends, and for your time in general listening to our podcasts. Please take care, and I'll see you guys here next time.